Alright, welcome back to our next video on World War II. We're going to look at the actual war in Europe and the Pacific. This is going to be a long video, so prepare yourself and get your groans out now. In this video, we're going to look at three things. One, what were the major events in both the Eastern and Western fronts? Why did the U.S. decide to drop the atomic bomb? And what were the outcomes of World War II? If you remember, on December 7th, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. The next day, President Roosevelt gives the day that will live in infamy speech, and within a few days, we are in the war, and Germany and Italy also declared war on us since we declared war on their ally. So a few weeks later, on December 22nd, 1941, Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, arrived in D.C., and for 2 weeks, him and Roosevelt talked about plans of the war. And Churchill convinced Roosevelt that Hitler was the greater threat and convinced him to join the European front full force rather than the Pacific. But it was kind of curious that even though the Japanese were the ones that bombed us and got us into the war, we were actually fighting the Nazis first. So, I want to preface all the stuff that we're going over and say that these battles are important. They're the dividing points in the war. But it's just important that you know a quick summary of what went on, not the specifics. So even though there's specifics here, I'm just going to quickly summarize them. I would encourage you to read the screen in order to create a summary that you should write down in your packet. So the Battle of the Atlantic. This is an ongoing battle that happened as soon as the United States declared war on Germany. Germany sent its U-boats to start bombing Allied ships like they did in World War II. And at first they were really good. They were bombing tons of ships, and the Allies were, having their ships destroyed and all this stuff. Then they started using the convoy system again, and they started building tons of ships. At one point, the United States was building over 140 ships a day. And so these ships had better sonar, and actually the Allies began to spot German U-boats before they could bomb them and started bombing German U-boats. Remember, U-boats are the name for their submarines, faster than Germany could build them. So by the end of 1943, the Allies won the Battle of the Atlantic. Then, if you think all the way to the east side, you have, in the Soviet Union, the Battle of Stalingrad. And this is kind of the turning point for the war, actually. Because in June 1941, the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. And because the Germans wanted to take the Soviet oil fields that were in the Ural Mountains. And so Germans, the last stop before the oil fields was the city of Stalingrad. And Germany actually had captured like 9/10 of the city. They were basically there. They were going block by block, killing Soviet troops. They were really making a massacre out of them. And so Stalin sent tons of reinforcements, and the winter set in, and Germany was unable to support their troops in the winter. And so the Soviets, in the winter of 1943, actually won the battle, even though they lost over 1.1 million soldiers. Just to put in that perspective, in the whole World War II, the United States didn't lose 1.1 million soldiers. Russians lost this many in one battle. So this is the importance of Stalingrad. This is the turning point of the war. The Nazis were winning to this point up until Stalingrad. You must know that. Then you have North Africa. So as the Soviets are battling in Stalingrad, the USSR wanted the Allies to open up another front. And Churchill and Roosevelt didn't believe that it would be smart to invade Europe at this time, that the Nazis were still too strong. So they invaded North Africa, where the Nazis and Mussolini had captured some countries. And what they did is they landed on the west coast of Africa by Morocco, and they pushed the Nazis all the way to Italy and up through the Italian boot there. And so by May 1943, the Axis powers in North Africa had surrendered. So remember, in January, Stalingrad's over. Then in May, they lose North Africa. Then, as soon as they lose North Africa, Churchill and Roosevelt had met in Casablanca and decided the way into Europe was through Italy. And so the Allied forces took Sicily, and then they started moving up the boot. And the King of Italy then stripped Mussolini of his power. as the dictator. And this is when Italy actually joins the Allied forces for a bit. The people of Italy were so excited because they thought the war was over, they were going to be liberated, it was great. Germany decided that was not going to happen, and they invaded Italy to keep the Allies down. And this battle ended up going to the end of the war when Germany was defeated. And this is why Italy, if you look on the map, flips between alliances, because when they were first invaded, they sided with the Allies. Then once the Germans took over government again, reinstated Mussolini, it gets a little muddy in the waters here, and they kind of flip back and forth, depending on who's in power. Then you have D-Day, the famous operation called Operation Overlord. And it was planned for June 5th, 1944, but due to weather, it took place on June 6th. You must remember this date. This is an important date here. June 6th is when D-Day happened. And what happened is you have England up here at the very top of the island, and during the night they sent planes, and you can see all the areas that men parachuted in behind the front lines. Then, in the early morning of the day, Britain, the United States, Australia, and Canada sent boats all along the Normandy coast to attack the Germans. It was a bloody battle, and we're going to watch a portion of this battle in class to fully illustrate it. But what had happened is it caught the Germans off guard because the Allies were sending communications that said they were going to land 150 miles west of here, and so Hitler moved a lot of the troops over there. But that was just a communication to throw them off. They had always planned to land in Normandy. And this is how they opened up another front. Now they have fighting the Russians along the Polish border, you have allies in Italy, and then you also have allies starting in Normandy. So the Germans are really starting to get invaded from three sides here. Then you have a turning point. Not a turning point, I should say a hiccup. So once the Allies reach Normandy, they invade, they kick the Germans out, and the Germans start retreating. They keep pushing back. And you can see on the map here, this is Belgium and France, and this purple line is the divide between the Allies and the Germans. And so once they invade Normandy, they kept pushing the Germans back until Operation or Battle of the Bulge. Hitler ordered an attack because the Allies had captured their first German city, and the Allied forces were weak along the Belgian border, and so he ordered an attack on Belgium. And so the German forces pushed really hard along this weak line and causing what's called the bulge in the line, which is how you get the name Battle of the Bulge. And you can see it here. It's kind of hard to see at points, but so the German forces push in and you get this little bulge that happens. And this lasts for about a month or so, but it actually devastates Germany because they lose tons of troops and equipment before the Allies keep pushing them. So, it's just really a hiccup, but it's the last kind of German attempt to, stay strong before the Allies invade. So, surrender. As the Allied forces, both Soviet and American and British, are liberating lands, as they're moving, they're freeing the people, they're giving back the governments, they're also liberating the concentration camps. And the Allies run across many. They knew what was going on, I don't think to the extent, but the Nazis, as they were leaving, tried to hide their crimes by burning the places or bombing them or killing all the survivors. But they had to leave in some cases in such a hurry that they were unable to do this. And so the first concentration camp is really discovered by the USSR in July 1944. And this is when it becomes public fully what the Nazis were doing, and the outrage across the world really hits an all-time high. So what happens? The Soviets were the first to Berlin. They beat the Americans and the British, and many soldiers, once the Soviets hit Berlin, started to desert the army. And instead of Germany trying to make things better for themselves, they start shooting their own soldiers and hanging them in the with trees around the city with cards that said, "We betrayed the Fuhrer." So there's tons of disconnect within the German government. Then on April 29th, you have Hitler who made his last address to the people and marries his longtime girlfriend. The next day, him and his now wife commit suicide and their bodies are burned. It only takes then a couple more days for Eisenhower to reach Berlin. Remember, Eisenhower is the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe. He is the head honcho of British and European forces, and he manages the campaign in Italy. He also manages D-Day. He really is why we were so successful in Europe. And he accepts the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich, which means that they surrender everything, all under all aspects. And it wasn't till this day that Germany gave up their full power, and that's why it's known as Victory over Europe Day, March 8th, or VE Day. We celebrate it because we have full victory. Well, this was a joyous occasion, and you see lots of great pictures of soldiers coming back home after this, kissing their wives and girlfriends. That's where the famous picture comes in, where they're in New York. Roosevelt actually died on April 12th, so he doesn't see the end of the war, sadly. He had a stroke while in Georgia, and he dies. And his Vice President Truman takes over then as the 33rd President of the United States. So, while that's all going on in Europe, you have the war in the Pacific here. And all this area in red is the extent of the Japanese Empire. The Japanese Empire was 3 times as large as the German Empire ever was, the Third Reich. And so they really expanded. Look how many countries they took over. From parts of China to Korea to Burma, Thailand, Indochina, which was owned by the French, Malaysia, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, which remember the U.S. owned up until this point, so they defeated the United States at this point. And really, I mean, they really were expanding under a huge empire, one of the biggest this region of the world has seen in centuries. And so the Pacific front is very difficult because of how spread out it is. If you go back a little bit and look at the map, it's not like Europe where it's all connected. It's very spread out, which gives some trouble. And so the first real battle is Doolittle's raid. And this happens in the spring of 1942 when Colonel James Doolittle led 16 bombers to attack Tokyo and other Japanese cities. It was a similar fashion of Pearl Harbor, and this was kind of known as the retaliation. Men signed up for this and were very excited to go on it. This is actually seen in the movie Pearl Harbor. If you've ever seen that scene at the end of the movie, this is what they're training for. And it kind of shocks Japan. It does shock them. But it also is a confidence booster to the United States and the forces. Like, just because they did this doesn't mean we can't attack them back. Then a little bit later that same year, Battle of the Coral Sea happened, and this is where the Americans teamed up with the Australians because the Japanese were, going for Australia, and they were going to invade there next. And the Battle of the Coral Sea really stops Japanese expansion. They never get to Australia. This is the furthest they ever get at this time. And the unique thing is that the entire battle was done for 5 days through airplanes taking off from aircraft carriers. There was no hand-to-hand or man-to-man combat on land. It was all during the air, which is kind of cool. Next, you have Battle of the Midway, and this is where the Allies finally broke Japanese code and knew that they were then going to the Midway Islands. And the Midway Islands are strategically important because they're halfway between Japan and Hawaii. So if they captured them, it could be devastating to the United States and Hawaii again. And so American planes started to scout out where the Japanese would go, since they knew that's their next thing. And they found the Japanese carriers. And so the U.S. then redirects their submarines and boats, and we torpedo the crap out of them. And they lose 4 aircraft carriers, 1 cruiser, and more than 250 planes. And so this battle, the Battle of the Midway, is the turning point for the war in the Pacific. The Battle of Stalingrad, the turning point of the war in Europe. This is the turning point of the war in the Pacific. Both battles you will need to know for that reason. Then you have Iwo Jima, where you get the famous picture here. And so after the Americans took back the Philippines, the Japanese took them from us, we took it back. We then turned to Iwo Jima, and no one lived on this island in the Pacific, but the Japanese had carved tunnels and caves into the rock, so it was strategically important. And so we took this island after days of fighting, um, and finally, uh, it was bloody, but we took the island. And of the 20,700 Japanese that were on the island, only 200 survived. 6,000 Americans also died. So this is really where the Americans see how devastating the Japanese fighting style of kamikaze is. You fight to the death. This is ingrained in their culture. It goes back to samurai time. And we're going to talk about this when we talk about the atomic bomb, because this is important. If you have all these Japanese that are willing to fight to the death or kill themselves while they're killing you, it's very difficult to win a war against them. Then you have the Battle of Okinawa, which happens in April 1945. And Okinawa is part of the Japanese island. And so this is where the U.S. Invades one of the Japanese islands for the first time. After this battle, and it was bloody, more than 110,000 Japanese died, again, using the style of kamikaze, because Japanese would rather get in a plane and crash the plane into something, killing themselves, than surrender. And so this fighting style becomes dangerous. And after the Japanese generals surrender, they do commit suicide, which goes back to the samurai tradition. And so this is where the United States first gains some Japanese territory. So then the war is starting to end. It's ended in Europe, but there's not an end in sight in Japan, unfortunately. But for all along, there's been the Manhattan Project. Remember, we talked about this a couple lectures ago. The Manhattan Project is the code name for the project to create the atomic bomb. It's the best kept military secret of World War II, even though, this kills me, 600,000 Americans worked on this project. But even Truman himself didn't know the atomic bomb project created until he became president. I mean, that's just crazy to me. And so in April, they don't believe they're anywhere close to being done. They thought it would be another year. Then in July of 1945, same year, they tested the first bomb. And Truman, without hesitation, once the test goes well, orders the general to prepare an attack on Japan. The reason that they cite that the atomic bomb was necessary was because of the Japanese fighting style. If the Japanese were so willing to kill themselves to win the war, when we invaded the island of Japan, the main island, there's no telling how many people would kill themselves in kamikaze fashion to fight us. And so they thought if they dropped the atomic bomb, it would devastate cities, but it would save a lot of American lives, and it would eventually save Japanese lives. And so they dropped the first atomic bomb on August 6th, 1945, on Hiroshima. And it's called, the atomic bomb's code name is Little Boy. And this was an important Japanese military center. Before we dropped the bomb, we gave them tons of notice. People of Japan, tell your government to surrender, or you will be undoed on, much harm. They didn't surrender. We dropped the bomb. We gave them a few days. The government still did not surrender, and so we dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki on 3 days later, August 9th. And this was called Fat Man, the name, in case you are wondering. If you're ever wondering the order of how the bombs were dropped, it's alphabetical. H, then N. Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. We then let it leak to Japan that we had one more atomic bomb we were willing to drop. We never did. We only made 3. The one they tested in New Mexico and the 2 in Japan. But Japan didn't know that. And so the Emperor of Japan, who was the figurehead at this time, got so nervous that, the citizens are dying. 500,000 people died as a result of these bombs, that he ordered the Japanese generals to draw up plans for surrender. And so less than a month later, September 2nd, the official surrender is signed by Hideki Tojo and given to General Douglas MacArthur on September 2nd, 1945, which becomes Victory Over Japan Day, or VJ Day. So, after this devastating war that happens on 2 continents, you have to start rebuilding. And so, The big three, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, met in Yalta in February 1945. So before the war was ended, but they knew they were winning, it was only a matter of time. And so they started to make plans for peace. Stalin wanted Germany to be divided up into zones between those countries so that Germany could never take over Europe again. And Churchill hated this idea. And so Roosevelt acted as an intermediary and compromised. They got temporary zones between the two, which we'll talk about in next unit in the Cold War. The Soviets would enter the war against Japan because at this point we didn't think we were winning. That's why we needed the atomic bomb more than ever. And then they discussed plans to all join the United Nations, which they did. So some big ideas come out of Yalta. So you have to know, out of Yalta, you get the UN, you get divided zones of Germany, and that Soviets would enter the war in Japan. You must know these three. And then the three people that were there. Then, after the war, to kind of bring closure, or try to Europe, this big European countries, Germany, France, the United States, and the Soviets, put on the war trials against top Nazi officials. They put them on crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, and war crimes. Of the 24 top members that they sentenced at Nuremberg, 12 were sentenced to death. The other 12 went to jail. Then, in the next 3 years, they will try thousands of other Nazis in this time. Most will go to jail, only few others will die. But many people just said, you can't blame us, we were just following orders. And this becomes the plea of Nazis across the world. You can't blame us, we were just following orders. And this leads to a whole series of psych experiments on how this could be possible. Then, bringing closure to Japan, after Japan surrenders, the United States occupies Japan for 7 years, and the occupation is led by Douglas MacArthur. In the meantime, the United States reshapes the Japanese economy using free market principles, and while Germany was devastated after the war, Japan, because the economy was formatted and reshaped, they end up coming out of the war very prosperous soon after. And then we also do war crimes against the Japanese for what they did in Manchuria and the Philippines because they did crimes against humanity there. And we sentenced Hideki Tojo to death as well. So, review. Finally, we're here. I know this is a long video, and we're going to spend a lot of time on what's going on in the war. Now, it's not important that you know everything that happened, but it is important that you know the big ideas. So, what were the major events? Well, you have the turning points in the war. The Battle of Stalingrad in Europe, then the Battle of the Midway in the Pacific. You have, the Allies, or the Axis were winning in Europe up until the U.S. got involved. Stalingrad happened. Then we invade North Africa, then Europe, then D-Day happens. We get into France, and then all forces slowly converge on Germany. In Japan, we enter the war against them. We start island hopping, jumping island to island, defeating the Japanese. Eventually, we meet them at Japan. Why did we decide to drop the atomic bomb? Well, the United States thought because of the Japanese kamikaze fighting style, they were willing to kill themselves, and much more people would die than dropping 2 atomic bombs. And then what were the outcomes? Well, we put Nazis and Japanese officials on crimes against humanity. Many were sentenced to death. Many went to jail. Then we start to rebuild both economies, Japan and Germany, because we thought if we can rebuild their economies, then they won't be mad like Hitler was and Germany was after World War I, and so we won't face this problem again. Instead, we face the Cold War, which we'll talk about next.